Go like that?
That's fine. There was talk earlier today about automation, and I see that we have some. And sometimes it does the right thing, and sometimes it does things we don't want it to do. Perhaps I can start out by telling you about sitons. Sitons are subatomic particles which are emitted by audiences. And that would be okay, except that sitons have a deleterious effect, a bad effect on computer equipment. And it is sitons that explain whenever there are computers involved, something goes wrong. And you just have to live with it. Usually you get told what you would have seen had everything been working. Now, I live in Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon is a wonderful town. It has a small town feel, and it's quite a big enough town to have quite good theater and orchestra and other things that make life reasonable, and nice restaurants and so on. And Portland is about halfway between California and the northern border of the United States on the west coast. And it's a very relaxed town. People there take life a little easy and try and enjoy life in addition to working. When my wife Marley is here in the front row, and when we decided to move to Portland, we went to Portland State University and talked to the head of the engineering division there. Said, we're going to be in Portland. Would it be okay if we set up a research institute at Portland State University? And he said that would be fine. And shortly thereafter, by magic, a nice place for us to set this institute up appeared, some space. Now, those of you who know about universities know that space is one of the hardest things to come by on a university campus. By magic, this very nice space appeared, and it is exactly between the computer science department and the electrical and computer engineering department. And our research institute, called the Asynchronous Research Center, reports to the Dean of Engineering. Marley is the director of the Asynchronous Research Center, and she has an appointment in the computer science department, and I have a visiting scientist appointment in the electrical engineering department, and we regularly talk to both groups. I think the dean was hoping that this would enhance the communication between these two groups who sit across the hall from each other, and I think indeed it's done. We've made many friends on both sides of that corridor. You may wonder what asynchronous research is. Asynchronous means not synchronous. Almost all computers have a clock in them that ticks, and everything in the computer marches in a very military fashion, doing one step for each tick of the clock. And that's a wonderful convenience for designers who design electronic equipment, because it allows them to tell exactly what's going to happen on each step. It's a terrible way to design electronic equipment, because on each step there's a huge consumption of current, and then between steps there's very little, and so the power supply has to be very well crafted. And indeed, distributing time, distributing the clicks of the clock throughout the computer is a very challenging engineering task. Now, we think that neither of those is necessary, that instead a computer could be organized more like a civilian economy, where each part does its thing at its own pace, and when it's finished says, I'm done, and lets whatever is to happen next happen. Unfortunately, it's a bit harder to do that kind of design. The Asynchronous Research Center we set up with the intention of learning about that, teaching about it, training engineers to do it, and building some examples. That's what I do now, but this is a talk about graphics, and so I'm going to turn my attention back so we can see what happened in the past, and perhaps I can say a little bit about what we learned over the years through the research that I was involved in. There's going to be three parts to this talk. A history part. The risk of inviting an old man to come talk to you is that he will reminisce. And indeed, I'm going to. I have some stories about some people that you may have heard of, and I've got to tell you a little bit about my own history as well. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the things we learned from doing computer graphics, things which I think are lessons that need to stick with us all even today. And finally, I want to make some comments about the things that are similar in art and in engineering. And I see quite a lot of similarity between the activities of artists and the activities of engineers. And there's a number of levels of those activities that I want to bring to your attention. So we'll start with history. I first came to Germany in 1954. How many people were born then? Are you prepared to admit that you were born in 1954? I arrived in Germany, came into Heidelberg basically. The occupation was still on. Heidelberg was part of the American zone. I stayed with a man there who was in charge of the Boy Scouts for the servicemen and their families. And he took me a number of places. I saw quite a lot of Heidelberg. And then my mother came and met me there, and she said, we have to go to Berlin and see the Berlin Wall. So in 1954, I went through Checkpoint Charlie into the Eastern Zone, and it was a tremendous lesson in the contrast in the economies of the East and the West. A lesson I'll never forget. The one side was vibrant, clearly doing well. The other side was sleepy and a little impoverished. But all of Germany knows that now. The unification of Germany, I think, has brought that to the attention of all of us. I went off to Carnegie Mellon, got a degree. I went to Caltech. In 1960, I left Caltech and drove across Canada. I drove all the way across Canada, Highway number 1, not all of which was paved. There were hundreds of miles of dirt road that we crossed. I arrived at MIT in 1960 with a pregnant wife. She was within 2 months of giving birth to our daughter. And fortunately, she had an uncle in town. His name was the same as mine, Ivan, but it was pronounced Ivan because it was a Slovak family. And he had a son also by the name of Ivan. Uncle Ivan at that time worked for the Raytheon Company and had done quite a lot on making microwave ovens. Ivan Getting was his name, and he had been number 18 badge at the MIT Radiation Laboratory during the war. And shortly after we arrived, he and his wife announced their intention to move to Los Angeles, and was there any furniture that they had that we would like to set up our household? Well, that was a real break for a young graduate student with very little money and a pregnant wife. So they left town. I had another good break, which is I had met Claude Shannon when I was about 11 or 12. I'd gone down to Bell Laboratories and spent a day with him, the best part of a day with him, and asked him all sorts of questions and so on. And he apparently remembered that because when I wrote to him and said, I'm coming to MIT, could I come visit you? He said, absolutely, but you have to come to my house because I never go to MIT. He was a professor at MIT, but he was fairly reclusive by then, and he stayed at home, and he and his wife, Betty, were also very nice to us, and we developed what often happens between professors and students. We developed a warm, friendly relationship. I went to the Lincoln Laboratory as an intern originally, and then as a research assistant while I was doing my work at MIT. The Lincoln Laboratory is about a dozen miles away from MIT. It's out in the suburbs. And its major effort was working on computing stuff. And it had built the TX2 computer just to show that transistors could be used to build a computing machine. And the group that built the TX2 was the nucleus of the Digital Equipment Corporation. A large number of them split off and formed DEC and used the technology that had been developed for the TX2 to build DEC's computers. TX2 was there, and I remember distinctly going in to see Wes Clark, who had been the chief engineer of TX2, and asking him if I could use it. I told him a little bit about what I had in mind. I wanted to try and make drawings on the computer. And he looked at me, he puffed on his pipe a little bit, and I told him what I had in mind, and he didn't answer. And then I said, well, do you need a little more time to think about it? And he didn't answer. And then he said, no. You know, my world came to an end. He said, no, I don't need any more time. You're on. And he subsequently and I also became quite good friends. He's now, I think, over 80. Marley and I had dinner with he and his wife about 2 months ago when we were on the U.S. East Coast. I happen to know, as we speak, he and his wife are in Australia. So lifetime friendships develop over academic activities, as the younger of you may not yet recognize, but believe me, it is so. Well, the TX2 computer was a wonderful computer. It was the biggest machine in the world. Now, most computers today go, what, a few gigahertz, right? Like 2.5 or 3 gigahertz. Well, the TX2 went 1/10 of a megahertz. So that's a factor of 15,000 or so slower than today's ordinary computers. And today, computers like the ones I saw in the hall the other day, there's some, or this one that's right here, have many megabytes of dynamic memory. TX2 had 1/4 of a megabyte of dynamic memory. It had one of the very first xerographic printers. The Xerox Corporation had just figured out how to manipulate the paper and so on to make xerographic paper printers. And so the Lincoln Laboratory paid them to develop a special printer for the TX2. It was a wonderful thing. It printed on rolls of paper, and the rolls of paper went through and got the powder deposited on them from the xerographic drum by electrostatic action, and then they went through a warming thing which melted the ink to fuse it onto the paper, and then it came out of the front of the machine. Of course, being the first model of this kind, occasionally the paper would get stuck and the warming would warm it until it burned. And so when the paper came out, there was a convenient bucket about that size made of steel with a steel lid. In case there was a fire, you had to put the lid on quickly, and all fires had to be reported in the log of the computer room. Well, those were the days. Computer science hadn't been invented yet. I remember several years later, standing in the front of the computer science department at the University of Utah, and Al Perlis came to visit, and he looked at the sign that said computer science above the door, and he said, will somebody please tell me what that is? And I think that's a hard question to answer even today. Is that a science? Is it a mathematics? Is it an engineering discipline? What is it that we learn from our computers, and how do we learn about what to deal with them? I remember the day that I had made straight lines on the face of the TX2 screen, and Claude Shannon came for a visit. He said, that's pretty nice, Ivan, but I think you should do circles as well. Now, straight lines, the drawing area for TX2 was huge. It was hundreds of meters square, and the screen was about this size. And so I had to make TX2 calculate what parts of this enormous drawing would actually show on the screen. And so it had to essentially cut around the screen and throw away all the stuff that wouldn't show. And a straight line can only show one piece on the screen. If you imagine the screen here and straight line here, it'll have one segment, and maybe the first end of it and the second end will disappear, but there's only one segment of a straight line. But a circle starts somewhere and goes around and ends. And if you position the circle in a strange place so it starts near a corner, then it disappears off the screen, then it reappears for that corner, then disappears, reappears, disappears, reappears, and then disappears, and then the end of it reappears. So it can have 5 parts on the screen. And besides, to figure out where the circle and the edge of the screen intersect requires using Pythagoras' theorem, and so you have to take a square root. There was no built-in square root routine for the TX2. It could multiply and it could divide fixed point numbers, no floating point. Floating point hadn't been invented yet. So I had to figure out how to do all that and make clipping work for circles. And the result was Sketchpad. And I thought the interesting part of the whole exercise was, how do you tell the system what you want the drawing to look like? If you've seen movies of Sketchpad, you've seen it with the images changing as you watch till they line up and lines become horizontal and vertical and so on. And that was done by constraints. I was able to point to a line and add to the data structure something that said, this line is supposed to be vertical. Do your best to make this line vertical. Now, solving constraints is hard. Turns out that's a challenging job. I sort of did it a little bit, but not very well. And I don't know of any further work that was done on it for 20 years until James Gosling, the guy who invented Java, did a constraint thesis at MIT in which he solved the constraints algebraically. I had solved them numerically by just calculating new positions until things moved to where they should be. And Gosling did a much more interesting job of figuring out the algebraic nature of the constraints and then solving the algebra problem in order to just get the answer. I've often thought that an ounce of algebra is worth at least 20 kilograms. Notice that quick change to metric, right? What do I use for a small unit of something, a gram? Yeah, there's got to be a colloquial word for a little hunk of something, right? Anyhow, an ounce of algebra is worth hundreds of pounds of arithmetic. If you can pose a problem algebraically, you can get a solution that is good for all of the possible inputs. If you do it arithmetically, you get only one answer. Anyhow, Sketchpad worked pretty well, and I was able to make drawings. And I want to, a little later on, I'll tell you some things about what we really learned there. And then I went in the military service. And fresh PhD in computing, and the military service didn't quite know what to do with me. So they sent me to the University of Michigan, where the people were doing a great deal with brand new, recently invented lasers. And I was one of 3 military officers associated with this big university research contract. There was a colonel, there was a major, there was a lieutenant. Guess which one was the lieutenant? The colonel was a wonderful man. He looked at me and he said, I asked for somebody who would just do the paperwork. And they send me a MIT PhD. It'd be a waste of your time to do the paperwork. Your job is to go into this research organization, learn what they're doing, and 3 days a week you're going to give me an hour's lesson. What a learning experience. It was a tremendous learning experience. So I talked to these people. I learned things about lasers. I learned things about side-looking radar. I learned all kinds of things there that were new. And then nobody would take the IPTO job in the Pentagon. They asked all the sensible people, all the academics who should have taken the job, said, no, we don't want to move to Washington. But I was in the Army. And so I didn't get a say about it. I got some orders one day that said, you are transferred to Washington. Bye. So we moved household, 2 young children. We moved off to Washington. And I took the IPTO job. They gave me $15 million a year and said, go sponsor computer research. That would have been too hard a job for me, but fortunately, J.C.R. Licklider, known as Lick to all his friends, Lick had set up a wonderful set of researchers. The best people in the country were working on sponsorship from that office. And so all I had to do was carry on the start that Lick provided. And I don't think I stumbled too badly. Sponsoring research is a very challenging job. I'm pretty sure I wasted half the money, but I don't know which half. And probably will never know. But that project sponsored work at Berkeley, sponsored work at MIT, sponsored work at Carnegie Mellon, sponsored work at the System Development Corporation in California. In fact, most of the computer research at the time was funded out of that office. And my job was to learn what it was all about and defend it to the folk in the Pentagon who were responsible for providing the money. It was kind of a traveling fellowship. And a wonderful experience I had doing that. And just because nobody else would take the job. Well, I want to tell you a few stories about some people, because part of the history is the people. I went to the 100th anniversary of MIT, which was 1961, roughly. I sat in the audience, and one of the people who was there was Norbert Wiener, the man who coined the phrase, the term cybernetics. Norbert Wiener was noted on the MIT campus for his absent-mindedness. And the only evidence I have of that is he gave a talk in which he talked about various games. He said, now there's some games like bridge, which are partly chance and partly skill. He said there are other games like chess and checkers, in which clearly there's no chance involved. He said, now the simplest of those games I know is tic-tac-toe. It's the one where you put oughts and crosses in a 9 3x3 squares. And he said, now, that's a game in which there's no chance involved, and it's always won by either the first player or the second player, I forget which. Now, as you probably know, tic-tac-toe is always a draw if properly played. Anyhow, that's my Norbert Wiener story. J.C.R. Licklider was a wonderful man. He was a psychologist by training. And he gave a talk much like this one, and I was tempted to copy his behavior, but I thought I refrained. He got up to give his talk, and he took out of his pocket a banana. And he didn't say a word. He proceeded to peel the banana. And then he ate it. And it took several minutes for him to eat the banana. The audience was beginning to get nervous and wondering what was going on. And finally he started his talk. And he started his talk with the words, "You may not remember what I say here, but you'll never forget this banana." And I have to confess, I haven't the slightest idea what the talk was about. Claude Shannon. Now, Claude Shannon is the guy who named the bit. We're all familiar with bits. And he told me one time that he picked the name very carefully. He picked a meaningful English word which was very short because it was a very small unit of information. And bit is an Anglo-Saxon word. English has these polysyllabic Roman words, and it has these short Anglo-Saxon words. And if you swear in English, you always use Anglo-Saxon swear words. And all of the words that have punch is one of them, come from the Anglo-Saxon side of the language. And he chose bit, which is clearly an Anglo-Saxon word, and it had meant, as long as I knew, a small thing. So you could have a bit of ice cream, you could have a bit of a vacation, you could have, something, a small piece of something. And he picked that name for the unit of information, the bit, a 1 or a 0. And of course, because it was an easy to remember term that was appropriate, it has stuck over the years. Late in his life, I asked Shannon what he was doing. He said, well, we know the rate at which mutation happens in the chromosomes. We know how often cosmic rays strike the DNA material and cause it to change. He says, I'm wondering whether information theory would explain the complexity of the genetic material based on the known rate of mutation and the known period that life has been on Earth. And I said, well, how has it come out? I mean, it'd be nice to know the answer to that, wouldn't it? He said, well, he said, I cannot explain the amount of information in the chromosomes on the basis of those two numbers. And I immediately said to him, well, that's evidence for creationism, isn't it? And he said, oh, no, he said, I hope not. Marvin Minsky was on my thesis committee. Marvin Minsky is still around. He's quite an old man now. But he was well known as a leader in the artificial intelligence world. He said to me one time, he said, I've got 900 pages of a 300-page book written. And the hard part is to make the book shorter rather than to make it longer. It's a little like Mark Twain once apologized for writing such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. But Marvin Minsky said something which I think is very penetrating about artificial intelligence. He said, once we've made it happen in computing, we will understand it, and we will no longer think of it as intelligence. Intelligence, the essence of intelligence is its mystery. That was a brilliant idea. However did you do that? I simply don't understand how you could possibly have that idea. You must be a very intelligent person because you do things that I don't understand. And when we do understand them, Marvin said, we won't think of them as intelligent. I think that's some words to ponder. I liked Marvin Minsky a lot, but Tony Ottinger, who was a contemporary of mine at Harvard, once said something about him. He said, well, Marvin Minsky never does what he says and consequently isn't nearly as bad as he sounds. Okay, that's enough reminiscing about people. I went off to Harvard in 1966, became an associate professor of electrical engineering on the Gordon McKay Endowment. Was an endowed chair, but that's not surprising because all chairs at Harvard are endowed. They have this huge endowment. They simply don't allow research money from outside to pay for their faculty. While I was in the Pentagon, I had become aware of a project to help helicopter pilots land in close quarters at night. And the idea was very simple. You put underneath the helicopter, you put an infrared camera so that the camera will pick up whatever light is around, or else maybe you have some infrared searchlights there that other people can't see. And then the output of this infrared camera is displayed to the pilot through a set of cathode ray tubes that come in front of his helmet, and so he can see what the camera sees down below. And the people at Bell Helicopter had done some experiments with this to show that the pilot would identify his position as being where the camera was, and therefore would be able to look around and figure out how to land. And one of the experiments they did was to put the camera on the roof and the observer sitting in a chair in the building. And there were two people on the roof who were playing catch with a ball. And the observer was able to watch the ball go back and forth like this. And then one of them threw the ball at the camera, and the observer ducked. And so it was quite clear he had identified his position as being where the camera was, not where he was. And I got the Bell Helicopter Company to tell me what the display was that they used, and my contribution was to say, hey, we don't need the camera, we've got a computer. And at Harvard, we set up a project to, in fact, build the head-mounted display, and we had a great deal of fun doing it. We didn't know it was called virtual reality in those days, and of course it wasn't very real because all that we could compute in 3 dimensions at that time was a few lines. And so what you saw was a cube of lines, transparent cube of lines, hanging in space before you, and you could move your head and line up with this edge of the cube, or you could move over here and line up with that edge of the cube, or you could walk around the cube and look at it from that side. It wasn't very real. It didn't fool anybody into thinking that it was real. But it was convincingly 3-dimensional. We did not do stereo. One of the reasons we didn't do stereo is my left eye doesn't work very well, and so I don't have stereo vision at all. And it turns out stereo vision is much overrated. Okay? I can tell which of you is in front of which other because as I move around, the one image that I see changes. Between the 2 images of my 2 eyes this far apart is lots less than the difference in the image when I move my whole body. Stereo vision is wonderful for threading needles. I'm always amazed when people thread needles this way. They can tell how far the thread is and how far the needle is. I can't do that. I thread a needle this way. I went off to Salt Lake City. We started the Evans and Sutherland Company. Salt Lake City is a very Mormon town. My partner, Dave Evans, was from an old-line Mormon family. His grandparents had walked to Salt Lake City from St. Louis with the Mormon migration. His father was the head of the Evans Advertising Agency, which at that time was the largest advertising agency outside of Madison Avenue in New York. Advertising agencies are traditionally run by Jewish folk, but this one was run by a good Mormon. So one time, we were going to make an advertisement for the Evans and Sutherland Company. I thought it'd be nice to have some text on this advertisement on the screen. And so I asked Danny Cohen, a former student of mine, to write a program that would put some text on the screen. And I failed to specify Roman text, so it came back in Hebrew. And I thought, okay, that'll be a catchy ad. I mean, not everybody puts Hebrew text up on their ad. And I sent it off to the Evans Advertising Agency to prepare the advertisement. Well, it came back and it was left justified. So it was, the left edge of it was all lined up and it was ragged on the right edge. And I knew just enough about Hebrew to know that it's read right to left, not left to right, and so probably this was wrong. How are we going to tell? Who in Salt Lake City could tell us? Well, there was a wonderful delicatessen run by an old-line Jew by the name of Lou Dornbush. And Lou Dornbush ran this wonderful delicatessen, and Lou Dornbush was the same dimension, anything you measured. If you measured him top to bottom, okay, if you measured him around the middle, it was all the same dimension, right? That kind of a guy. And he knew the guy from the advertising agency, and he knew me. And we came in with this ad and put it on the counter. We said, now, Lou, is this printed backwards? Is it left to right, or is it, or is it okay? Lou Dornbush looked at John, who was the guy from the advertising agency. He looked at me, he looked at the ad, he looked at me, he looked at John, he looked at the ad. He said, it's backwards. That'll be $150. Well, the Mormon influence was fairly strong in Salt Lake City, and I had growing children who were in grade school. And I thought, I've got to get as far away from here as I can. And so I didn't move very far in distance, but I moved a long way in social structure. Namely, I moved to the beach in Santa Monica. And in those days, this is 1974, that was a part of the world in which the view folk had of the world was much more casual than nearly anywhere else. And we bought a big house on the beach, and the children both graduated from Santa Monica High School. It was a fine place to live. And with my friend Glenn Fleck, I started a thing called Picture Design Group with the intention of making movies by computer, 1974. Well, we were, 20 years, maybe 25 years too early. So that failed miserably, and I got offered a job at Caltech, so I went off to Caltech, which is on the other side of Los Angeles. I commuted back and forth, but that's a whole other story. Now, somewhere during the Evans and Sutherland period, Bob Schumacher and Bob Sproul and I had written a paper which is called a categorization of 10 hidden surface algorithms. And we made a taxonomy of the then known 10 hidden surface algorithms. And we noticed something about them, that they all involved sorting. The only differences between them were which orders they did sorting. Some sorted horizontally first and then vertically and then in depth. Some sorted in depth first and then vertically and horizontally. One by John Warnick, who later founded the Adobe Corporation, sorted by dividing the world. If the situation it had was too complicated, it just chopped it in 4 pieces and said, can I draw that one? Can I draw that one? If that's too complicated, it chops it again until it got a piece that was simple enough to draw. and then drew that. It's called the Warnick algorithm. It's one of the simplest ones. But we noticed that these were all sorting of different kinds. And I took a look at that and said, do I want to spend the rest of my career seeking better and better sorting algorithms to do better and better computer graphics? And besides that, there were a lot of young fellows who were involved in computer graphics and thought it was neat to make those pictures, and they really wanted to have a go at it. And I felt like a man riding a bicycle with a steamroller coming behind him. Right? So I said, I better do something else. And I went to Caltech, and at Caltech there was a wonderful man by the name of Carver Mead. Carver Mead is best known for the textbook he wrote about VLSI design called Mead-Conway. Now, Carver Mead was my colleague at Caltech, and Lynn Conway worked for my brother at Xerox PARC. By the way, so did Alan Kay, to the extent that Alan Kay ever worked for anybody. Bert can tell you all sorts of stories about managing Alan Kay. You don't manage Alan Kay, you suggest, you know, anyhow. So that's how they met. They each knew a Sutherland, and of course my brother and I knew each other and were quite close. So I'm not going to pursue that story any further than that, but that's how I happened to leave the field of computer graphics and enter the field of integrated circuit design, which, by the way, has some graphics involved in it, but that's not the center of the game. I think I've talked enough about history. I'd like to talk a little bit about learning. So here's what we learned from the work I did on Sketchpad. Here we have an array of windows, carefully drawn array of windows. And there's one of them I'm pointing to with an arrow there. And if I say delete, what do you suppose will happen? Don't all speak at once. Maybe that's not what I intended. Oops. Okay, so let's try again. I'm going to point to that window and say delete. Oops, maybe that's not what I intended. And what we're seeing here is the structure of the drawing being revealed. This deletion is caused if the structure of the drawing is 4 rows of 7 windows each. The previous one is if there's 7 columns of 4 windows each. You can't see that when you look at the drawing. It's the structure of the drawing that underlies is different than what you see. There's more to the structure than meets the eye. And the big lesson of Sketchpad was that unlike a drawing with pencil on paper, where all there is dirty smudges on the paper, there's an underlying structure to the drawing, which is all important. And in those days, the notion of structure in computing things was not very well understood. And certainly the lay people of the world didn't even think about it. And today, almost everybody has a telephone directory that has some structure in it. It's alphabetized by names, and then under each entry you have various phone numbers that this person has. Or you have a file system in your personal computer which lists all your financial files, and then they're all there, and then all your holiday files, and they're all in there, and so on. It's a structured file system. So this is evidence of structure, and the big lesson of Sketchpad was computer drawings have structure as well as appearance. And that message, I think, stands today. If you understand the structure and give commands that act with the structure in the way you want, you get the answer you probably expected, which in this case was to get rid of that one. There's been a long debate about whether one should make drawings as passive objects that are just there, or whether one should define the drawings as procedure. To make this drawing, should I say, make a column out of 4 windows and make 7 columns? That's procedure. Or I can just lay them all down as individual things. Now, the way I actually made these pictures was with Adobe Illustrator. And the folk in Adobe, very sensibly, do not give the drawings any structure. You can copy a piece of a drawing and put it down somewhere else. So what's really here is 28 separate windows. And in order to make illustrations today, I had to actually erase 7 windows in a row or 4 windows in a column to make the pictures that illustrate what I'm talking about. And Adobe has done that because folk who use Adobe Illustrator don't want to be bothered with understanding the structure. And computers have so much memory today that you can afford to make a complicated picture and simply spread it all out so all the pieces are independent. When I did Sketchpad, we didn't have enough memory. Remember, we had only 1/4 of a megabyte. Had to store everything, including the display. But the structure is all important. The structure is what lets you draw a circuit diagram and specify both what the circuit diagram looks like and which wires in the circuit diagram are connected to which other ones. So when you're finished with the drawing, you can point to a wire and say, light up all of the wires that are connected to this wire. And some of them may be connected this way, and some of them may have a name on it saying this is wire 23, and over here is another one that says wire 23. And if you say light up all the wires that are connected to this one, that'll light up, and so will this one, because it's connected by the magic of names rather than by the magic of touching. So the structure of the thing is important. How many of you use a word processing program? How many of you don't use a word processing program? Okay, that's what the answer I want to try. Now, if you erase the last word of a paragraph and the first word of the next paragraph, what happens? Sometimes the font changes. Has that ever happened to you? This happens to me a lot. That piece of text has some structure in it. And I used to understand how it worked. It used to be that the font of the paragraph was stored in the paragraph end mark. So if you deleted the paragraph end mark, that paragraph would take on the font of the next paragraph. But that's not quite true anymore, and I don't know why. My model of the structure in my word processing program is deficient. And so it does things that I don't understand. You've had that experience, I take it. Oh, you bet. Okay? Structure is important, but it's not visible. And they don't tell you about it. If they would tell you about it, you could learn how to use the programs better. But they don't tell you. So the big message from Sketchpad was structure is there, deal with it. And we're still dealing with it. And I think we will deal with it as long as there are computers. So the big learning from Sketchpad was computer pictures are different than paper, and the way they differ is that they contain structure. Well, there was some learning out of the head-mounted display work, too. Okay, and the learning out of the head-mounted display work was lines are not enough. If you want to look at three-dimensional pictures, they have to look solid. And that means the computer has to compute what's behind what and leave it out. Now, to those of us who see things in the physical world, the light hitting an opaque object doesn't get through. And so there's a blue shirt back here, which from my point of view is hidden by the head in front of it. And I only see the shoulder part, and I can't tell what kind of buttons there are because they're hidden by the head right in front of the shirt. But if we were to make a computer picture of that, the computer would have to lovingly calculate how much of the shirt to show and how much of the shirt is obscured by the head. And that's an enormous calculation. And it became possible to do that calculation. Computers got powerful enough to do that computation about the time I went to Salt Lake City. And there was a flowering of computer graphics in Salt Lake City, and it was the result of three things. And I think great research projects have these three properties, and I'll tell you what they are in case you want to start one, although it's pretty hard. The first thing you have to have is a worthy problem. You have to have a problem that's worth doing, preferably one which computing has just gotten good enough to do. So nobody's done it before because they didn't have enough computing. In the case of the Salt Lake work, it was the hidden surface problem. How are we going to calculate which part of the shirt to show, which part not to show? It was a challenging problem. Second thing you have to have is money. And fortunately, the folk at DARPA thought that the research in graphics was important enough that they provided quite a lot of money to support the computers and the graduate students and some of the faculty. And that was a very valuable contribution. But the third thing that you need, which is the hardest of all to come by, is leadership. And there was a man at Utah by the name of Dave Evans. And Dave Evans was an incredible leader. He was as honest as the day is long. I won't say he was a devout Mormon, but he was a loyal Mormon. He ran the Boy Scout troop for the local church. He was on the governor's advisory committee to try and help the Utah government do sensible things. He was an honored professor at the university. He had been brought to Salt Lake City to start a computer science department by Jim Fletcher. Jim Fletcher was the president of the University of Utah at that time. Fletcher is better known as the administrator of NASA. He was twice administrator of NASA and took some time out in between to be the head of this University of Utah. And he handpicked Dave and said, come and start as a computer science department. And that was wonderful from Dave's point of view. His wife thought it was terrific. They were from Salt Lake, and they had 7 children. They wanted to be in Salt Lake. And when I suggested to him that we start the Evans and Sutherland Company, I was living in Boston. And of course, there were lots of companies started on Route 128, which is the circumferential highway around Boston. Polaroid was there, lots of companies. So I said, come to Boston, we'll get our company started. He said, sure, that'll be cool. And then his wife, Joy, made the following argument. Ivan has only 2 children, we have 7. Who do you think has the easier task to move? And that's why the Evans and Sutherland Company was in Salt Lake City. So the big learning from virtual reality was hidden surface problems important. And that's what we worked on in Salt Lake and did it quite successfully, I think. Now I'd like to turn my attention to quite a different subject, which has to do with some things that I think are in common between art and engineering and perhaps other fields of human endeavor as well. What city is this photograph taken in? Come on. What city? Las Vegas. Good answer. This one happens to be the Paris one, the real one. You know that the Statue of Liberty that's in New York is a copy? The real one is in Paris. It's not as big, but it's in Paris. Anyhow, this is obviously, and I think that this is an engineering object of some beauty. It's an icon of Paris. It was made by Mr. Eiffel. And why is it pretty? Well, it's obvious how it stands up. It's got a big, broad base. It tapers towards the top. Clearly, it doesn't need to be as strong at the top as it needs to be at the bottom. And so the shape explains what it does just like that. And everybody can appreciate that and think that's wonderful. What city is this taken in? What's that? That's the Golden Gate Bridge. That's right. That's San Francisco, folks. San Francisco. Yes, sir, San Francisco. I think this is a beautiful object, too. It has some intrinsic simplicity and some intrinsic beauty. The 2 towers obviously hold up these great big cables that go across the top. And the great big cables hold up those little vertical cables that go down that actually hold the deck of the bridge up. And so it's pretty obvious when you look at this how it works and what it does. And that's part of its beauty, is its simplicity. What city was this taken in? New York. That's the Brooklyn Bridge. Brooklyn Bridge was built by Mr. Roebling over 100 years ago. It's a magnificent thing. When I was a lad, I wanted to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge so bad I could taste it. And my mother hated to drive. She was a pretty bad driver, I must say, but she hated it. And I pestered her and pestered her and pestered her. I was probably 10 years old. And finally she said, okay, we'll drive in from the suburbs where we lived and we'll go and I walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. And I thought it was a wonderful experience. And what I failed to notice at that age was that the cables that hold up the roadway are not all vertical. You can see quite clearly here that some of the cables that support the roadway are diagonal. Now, why is that? Who in his right mind would put diagonal cables in to hold up the roadway when you have perfectly good, great big cables at the top and you can put vertical hangers, which there are here, to hold up the roadway? Well, this is the introduction to the second part of my talk about art and engineering, which is you can appreciate art because the thing that you see has intrinsic beauty. It's just nice to look at. And everybody can do that. Now, you may differ in opinion about whether a thing is nice or not, but the intrinsic beauty of an art object or an engineering object is there for all to observe. But underneath that, there's a second layer. And the second layer is accessible only to those who are students of that kind of activity. If you are a student of the master oil painters, you can tell who it is. Was it a Rembrandt, a Van Gogh? Was it a real Rembrandt, or was it somebody copying his style? And the students of that field can tell details that a layperson doesn't notice. And here are these diagonal cables. If I had asked you 5 minutes ago, are all the support cables for the deck of the Brooklyn Bridge vertical, you wouldn't have known the answer. And indeed, when I walked across this at age 10, I never noticed. Here's the Golden Gate again. Let's look at a couple of things that are a little strange about the Golden Gate Bridge. First of all, across the deck, there's this truss. What's that truss got to do with anything? The cables hold the bridge up. Why do I need to put a truss underneath the bridge? Well, there was a bridge built at Tacoma Narrows. Tacoma Narrows is a little south of Seattle, and it acquired the name Galloping Gertie. And the reason is it blew down. It was a thin ribbon that went across the river, and when the wind blew, it started doing this. And after a while, it collapsed. And there's actually movies you could see of it collapsing. Why did it do this? Because it wasn't stiff enough to stay still in the wind. It was like a thin ribbon that you blow at, which then vibrates. Those trusses at the bottom, and if you look carefully, you'll see that the deck, and there's a truss on the bottom of the bottom. So that makes a box. So there's a box underneath the roadway that goes clear across the bridge. That's the stiffening truss. And it makes the Golden Gate Bridge stiff enough so it only moves back and forth about half a meter in the wind. It really does move in the wind. I had a friend who was riding his bicycle across the Golden Gate Bridge when there was an earthquake. He didn't know that. He thought he'd had a stroke because he was no longer able to balance his bicycle. He said that scared him quite a lot. He said, I thought, well, something's gone wrong in my head. I can't balance my bicycle. So he got off the bicycle. And then he felt the bridge shaking. He said, then he got really scared. But it was designed to stand earthquakes. It was designed to move, to shake, but not to flutter in the wind. Well, it's a little notice about what that's there for. Now, those diagonal cables on the Brooklyn Bridge are there for the very same reason. They keep the bridge from doing this, because they form triangles with the vertical cables. I only learned that a year or two ago. Here's another detail of the Golden Gate Bridge. Notice the vertical wires come up, and they actually there's pairs of them. They actually go over the top of the big cable and back down. And then both ends are fastened to the deck. That's how it stays up. But if you just pass the cable, the little cables over the big cable, where it's at a steep angle like this, the little cables would simply slide past, right? So there's a saddle here. You can sort of see where the cable goes off. The big cable looks like it's a little thicker. Well, there's a couple of big pieces of cast iron that are clamped onto the big cable with bolts. And there's a groove in that piece of cast iron, which is just at the right angle to let the little cable go over the top. Well, where the big cable is steep, that clamp thing needs to really clamp onto the cable because otherwise the whole thing would slide sideways. But where the cable in the middle is almost horizontal, you don't need as big a clamp. And if you look carefully at the Golden Bridge, you'll see where it's horizontal, the clamps are much narrower and have only 4 bolts. And these ones that we see here are much longer, and they have about 8 or 10 bolts to clamp them on. It's a little detail that you wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't pointed it out to you. The person who has a little more depth of understanding of engineering things appreciates this kind of detail and can notice. Sometimes he notices a few things, sometimes he misses many of the details. But there's some amazing things in engineering that happen because the engineers worry about the detail. Details like the detail that artists put into the care with which they make the arrangement of the picture, the colors they choose, and so on, things which people skilled in the art appreciate. And those of us who just look at the art and say, well, there's a nice picture, don't really see. Now, I'm trying to remember what my next slide is. I'm afraid if I peek, I'll reveal the future. But I have to because I don't remember what comes next. Oh, I know what comes next. The engine in your automobile is a marvel of engineering. It's a very simple thing. It's got a crankshaft and it's got pistons that go back and forth and got a spark plug there, and you sort of understand what it is. But it runs when it's cold and it runs when it's hot. And that's amazing because steel changes size with temperature. Now, the Golden Gate Bridge changes length quite substantially with temperature. In fact, all bridges do because they're big enough pieces of steel. And this is an expansion joint. It's not from the Golden Gate Bridge, it's from some other bridge. But it's a set of fingers like this that cars can drive right over. And as the bridge gets shorter or the bridge gets longer, the fingers interdigitate more or less to account for the change in length of the bridge. And some engineer has figured out how much that's going to be, how deep the fingers have to be, where to put these expansion joints. And when you drive across a bridge next time, look around. See the expansion joint as you drive across it. When I was a boy, I used to ride the railroad, and it went clickety-clack, 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 because the pieces of rail were not more than 20 or 30 meters long. And they were connected together with what was called fish plates, which were 2 plates of steel on either side of the rail with 2 bolts in this rail and 2 bolts in that rail, a little crack in between. So when the rail got longer, it could slide and make the crack narrower, and when the rail got shorter, on a cold day, the crack got a little bigger. And so the railroad train went clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. And there's poetry that uses that rhythm for describing riding on the railroad. Railroads in this part of the world don't do that anymore. They go whoosh, clickless rail. Well, now, there's an engineering marvel if I ever saw one. You take 10 kilometers of rail with no joints, okay, and on a hot day, that 10 kilometers of rail is going to be about 1 meter longer than it is on a cold day. How do I do that? Well, the rail is fastened down to some, if you're in Britain, you call them sleepers. If you're in the United States, you call them ties, which are embedded in gravel usually. And they're fastened down strongly enough so the rail says, I'd like to get longer. And the ties say, no way, baby. No way. Stay where you are. It's too bad. You're too bad you want to get longer. We ain't going to let you. Okay? Well, sometimes the rail wins. Okay? Clickless rail is an engineering marvel, and you don't appreciate it when you ride. You say, oh, this really smooth ride. But there's magic under the wheels of that railroad. And the magic has to do with the thermal expansion of steel. Now there's a third level at which you can admire both art and engineering achievements. And I think the third level applies to almost every field of human endeavor. In fact, I think all three levels apply. In sports, okay, you watch a tennis player whack the ball. You know, Wimbledon is just over, right? We see him whack the ball, you say, wow, look at the skill of that person. Amazing individual performance. And then if you really know tennis, you can tell the form is so good, his serve is so terrific. Look at the training that that person has had and the amazing, you know, underlying things that you can appreciate if you know the game. If you're an aficionado of soccer, football, you can tell how the team playing is going and how they've passed the ball from one to another in order to score the points. But the third level has to do with appreciating the organization that's behind that endeavor. Why did the Golden Gate Bridge ever get built? The Great Depression was on, and somebody said, we can encourage the economy a bit by building a bridge across the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate Bridge, and likewise the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, were Depression-era projects started by an enlightened government which realized that you had to do something to prime the pump of the economy. There were many public works projects in the United States done at that time for that same reason. There was a thing called the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which engaged young men who would otherwise be unemployed and causing trouble and took them out in the wilderness to plant forests, to build roads, to build parks, all sorts of things to prime the pump of the economy. If you look at the great artists and you ask, who were the patrons of the great arts? Okay, the Medici family comes out big, right? They put a lot of money into supporting artists. An amazing organization behind the beauty which is left behind. Mr. Roebling built the Brooklyn Bridge. He not only built it, he raised the money for it, he persuaded the politicians that it was important, he got all the contracts organized and so on. It's an amazing piece of organization in addition to the engineering. And one has to admire at the third level human endeavors that involve groups of people. It isn't easy to organize big groups of people to do something. My favorite story about that is the definition of an IBM man-year. IBM is noted for putting lots of people on jobs. An IBM man-year is 720 guys finishing the job by lunch. It's absurd, isn't it? Fred Brooks wrote a wonderful little book that everybody should read called The Mythical Man Month. It's a great little book. So there's these three levels that you can look at human endeavors in. The surface level is just what you see. It's got beauty. The second level is the amazing skill of the people who did it. The brilliance of the engineering, the brilliance of the art, the wonderful things that human beings do. But the third one is even more important, which is how did the society arrange itself in such a way that this thing could happen? And that may be the most important piece of making things happen. I'd be happy to answer. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yes.
I'd be happy to answer a few questions if anybody wishes to. Sir, could you stand up so we can all see who you are?
Sorry, I just have a question because I missed it. What was the book called, the name that you mentioned like a few seconds before?
It's called The Mythical Man Month.
Okay, thank you.
It makes the point that you know, there are some jobs which are going to take a certain length of time. Okay, it takes 9 months to make a baby, and putting 2 women on the job doesn't shorten it at all.
Thank you very much.
Fred Brooks is the author of that one. Now I made him stand up so nobody else is going to ask questions. I thought Europeans always stood up when they asked. Here's a lady. Yes, please. Please. I'd love it if you would.
Well, I enjoyed your stories a lot, but I was wondering why you used, thanks for the great topic, but I was wondering why you used those examples of mechanical beauty to illustrate digital problems. And I'm wondering about that, and because all your other stories had a meaning, it was legends. So what's the story behind your illustration? You're illustrating the digital.
Okay, so I understand the question to be, why did I use bridges and not computer programs for my illustrations?
And I have to add, I'm an art historian, so I don't understand much of what.
Look, computer programs can also be very beautiful. Okay? But first of all, you have to look at them very carefully to see that. They don't display very well on the screen. Okay? And second of all, beauty is apparent mostly to people who understand computer programs. And I chose to take illustrations for my 3 levels of appreciation that I thought would be available to everybody. Okay? I could have picked some others. I could have picked ballet. Okay? I mean, there's the skill of the prima ballerina. And then there's the training school that's behind that. I mean, that's not a thing you reach in a year and a half. That's a lifetime training, right? And then there's the board of trustees that thinks that having ballet in our town is important enough to put money into it and to get their wealthy friends to contribute. No ballet that I know of pays for itself. So there are always patrons, right? And part of the beauty of going to the ballet is appreciating the work of the patrons.
But you said there's a fundamental difference between paper and the screen.
Oh, yes.
Again, why that comparison?
The fundamental difference between paper and the screen is the screen has structure behind it and the paper doesn't. And that's a simple lesson. I think we all see that today. But it's worth noting because it's something different. Yes.
I have a question concerning your asynchronous research, because I was wondering, it's beautiful to let everything and everybody have their own paces, but the question is, how do you mediate them?
Boy, that's a wonderful question. Do you have an hour or two? The basic answer is very carefully. Everybody has to announce when he's done, and everybody who needs to know that that's done needs to be told. And the hard part is making sure that everybody who needs to know does know. And so a critical part of the machine finishes its job. And then we have to be sure that the information that is done is given to everybody else who can now start. In the synchronous world, we arrange that job will be done at exactly 1 o'clock. Okay? And so at 1:01 p.m., everybody else starts his job, whether that guy's finished or not. Okay? And this can cause all kinds of disasters if he takes a little longer. The advantage of the asynchronous thing is, for example, when you do division. Dividing, okay, 4 by 2. Easy, right? Get the answer quick. Dividing 4,822,000 by 787, little harder. Takes me a little longer. I can take advantage of the easy cases if everybody who needs to know when I'm done will be told when I'm done. Then I can finish early and we can get on with the job. And the world that people live in is very asynchronous. Okay? And part of the trick of a free society is that we allow people to do things at their own pace, to do it as well as they can, to finish as soon as they can, and take advantage of that finishing soon. Taximeter is a wonderful example. Okay? You get in a taxi, pulls down the meter, drives you there, you pay the amount that's on the meter. Now he's free to pick up the next fare wherever he wants to. He doesn't have to wait until 2 o'clock. If he sees somebody sitting on the street right where he dropped me off, he'll pick him up. And man, that's efficient. That's so much more efficient than planning everything ahead of time. And we'd like to bring that to computing, that kind of efficiency. But it has to be done with great care because everybody needs to know what they need to know. Yes, sir. Make sure the people in the back can hear you.
There was a meeting room close to your office in Menlo Park at Sun Microsystems. And on the whiteboard, there was one word, and I'd like you to explain this word to me, and that was serendipity. So what does it mean, maybe in relation to what's still on the projected board?
Okay, well, there are a whole bunch of stories in English that begin with the syllable sir, because that is the title that is given to a knight in Britain. We don't have knights in the United States, right? It's a different kind of arrangement, right? But you know there have been 2 computer knights, right? Morris Wilks was Sir Morris Wilks before he died, and Tony Hoare is Sir Anthony Hoare. And so the question is, what knight is it who is always lucky? And the answer is serendipity. Okay? Serendipity is what happens when things come together that just fit nicely and everything goes forward. Okay? You want to have serendipity wherever you can get it. And it only happens by chance, by luck, and what it means is serendipity is things come together in just the right way so that it all goes together. Why am I here today? Well, some nice people invited me to come. And it happens that Marley's parents live a half a day's drive from here. So we stopped at Marley's parents and we had a nice evening, nice dinner. Her mother cooked us a wonderful dinner. Then in the morning we left and we drove here. Serendipity, right? That's one of the reasons I'm here, right? Yes, sir.
Does structure and hiding structure has got something to do with trivialization that we talk about all day long in the next 2 days? Would you think so?
Well, it appears easy. You see, you look at a picture, you know, Toy Story, wonderful piece of animation, right? And you look at that and you say, wow, the objects in there, the characters in there, always when they walk in front of something, it hides, right? And you just think that's, obviously that should be so, right? But it ain't obvious to the computer. The computer doesn't have eyes. The computer doesn't know about light. You have to program things so that the objects in front appear to be opaque and hide the objects behind. And the trivialization is the result appears trivial, but the effort to do it is far from trivial. Okay?
I have a question which is kind of not so easy to
You need to speak a little louder for my poor ears.
Of course. Yesterday night we talked at dinner together about calligraphy in China, and also about like the letters we use, and that there's a certain difference because in calligraphy you have kind of this visual picture. It has a different kind of it is a different kind of approach to a language to go to a picture rather than to have this at least you could say zeros and ones and stuff like that. And I reckon that with a computer you always have like this visual appearance and the structure behind, which is you could break it down to zeros and ones. And I always wonder like how transition more obvious, like from the picture to the computer things or to the programming languages. And sometimes I think like, how must an editor be for a picture? Let's say an interactive picture, a website, that I might just zoom in and between the pixels I find the HTML tags and I can like wires in a box or something, and I can just unwire them and put them in a different way together, and like I crash. So I don't know. Have you ever thought about this connection? Like how is it connected?
Well, okay, thank you. So the question is, have I thought about the connections between the pictures and the things that are behind them, like the HTML that's behind it? And yes, and there are strange things that you can do with images. I mean, an image like this image is a series of pixels that's made of, about 1 million pixels that you see on the screen. And each one has a different color. And you can't tell in the yellow part of that picture the very fine shades of the yellow. And so I could embed in this picture 1 million bits by simply making yellow a little darker or a little less dark by one least significant bit on each color. I could embed in here a message of 1 million bits, which you wouldn't see when you look at the picture, but it would be there. And this is one way of sending hidden messages from one place to another, is by embedding the messages in what otherwise would look like noise in the image. And there are lots of things of this sort where what you see is not necessarily what's there. Now, it used to be, long ago before photography, that the way you knew what something had looked like was somebody painted it. There's an awful lot of paintings of people, triumphal marches after a battle, the burghers of Calais, whatever it is, the depictions of people, which were the only way we had of capturing images. And then photography was invented, and people said, well, a photograph is now a reliable way to say what was. But today we have digital photographs, and we can easily doctor them up in various ways. There was this wonderful movie called Forrest Gump, in which he appears with various historic characters. In the movie, that's amazing. He was patched in, so part of the scene. And so photographs are no longer a reliable indication of what was there. So what do we use as a reliable indication? Somebody's signed drawing? I don't know the answer to that. But, the future is going to be fascinating, because as we gain control over images, we gain control over the past. We gain an ability to falsify records in various ways that may or may not be detectable. And one of the things I think that society is wrestling with is how to deal with the legalities that are produced by the host of new information sources that weren't there before. For example, when you apply for medical insurance, should they be allowed to insist on your DNA being examined to see if you're subject to any very serious diseases? I don't know the answer to that. Some legislature somewhere is going to have to decide. And I think that the political process that we have in democracies is a process wherein we answer the very hard questions. The questions not of engineering. The questions not of how should we build a bridge that goes across this place? How shall we analyze DNA to figure out what's it about? But the really tough questions of should we use the information from DNA analysis for purpose X, Y, or Z? And how do we organize our society? That third piece that I was talking about. How do we organize our society to provide good life for our children and our children's children? And I think sustainability is one of those pieces. How should we behave properly to leave for our children and their children a world which is as livable as the one that we inherited from our parents? And that's a very hard question. That's much more than an engineering question. It's partly a political question, partly an economic question. And I think that the political system is the system whereby we answer those very, very hard questions. The engineers can deal with the easy questions. But the hard ones we throw into the political arena. And sometimes they get answered pretty well, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes that political arena isn't the government political arena, it's something else. What is it that makes the World Cup in soccer something which the United States participates in only peripherally? Well, it's because the children of the parts of the world that are good at that game start playing it when they're that high. And so amongst all that population grows up the great players. Okay? There was a wonderful team that went into the Olympics to play basketball, you may remember. Magic Johnson led this team. And it was basically the professional basketball players from the United States, and they wiped the floor with everybody else. They'd been playing basketball since they were that high. It was an organization that made that skill available. And I think as the organization of our society changes, different things will come to the fore and other things won't. I think I've wandered on here long enough. Why don't we break up and go home?
And thanks again.